Greetings, Trinitarians. This podcast is possible partly because of Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary in Evansville, Indiana. If you're interested in beginning your theological academic journey at Trinity, contact us at Trinitysem, that's Trinitysem.edu today.
Despite Braxton Hunter's attempts to train wreck it at the end, I think this was a good show, and thank you for giving us your time. God bless.
The last 5 minutes of that were the best part.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of Trinity Radio. I am Jonathan Pritchett, and along with me is
Braxton Hunter.
And today we are going to talk about what makes a sermon or a lesson or a Bible study, what makes it deep. Stick around.
So
it's not heresy. It's
it's Harrison.
Wow! They gave us nothing but tradition and no argument. All they did was get on this stage, yell real loud, and set a straw man on fire.
Okay, now I was not impressed. I've never heard of this gentleman before, but.
And there is no evidence at all, except in the imagination of Dr. Braxton and like-minded thinkers, that there is such a thing as an objective morality.
All right, well, that was a very passionate speech by Professor Alvarez. However, let me point out a couple of things that I have not argued tonight that Professor Alvarez seems to think that I have argued.
Everything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence.
On behalf of humanity, God became man to die for the sin of the world. Then, because of that sacrifice, you can rise from the dead just like he rose from the dead. Welcome back. The answer to the question of what makes preaching deep is plenty of ice-cold coffee.
Ice-cold coffee's gross.
In a Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary embossed glass. That's what does it.
No.
What's wrong with Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary?
Nothing. It's the iced coffee you desecrate the cup with. It's gross. Coffee, I'm not a coffee drinker, but...
Yeah, so your opinions on this are completely useless. Everyone who watches this show is a coffee drinker.
The reason why I'm not a coffee drinker is because coffee's gross. No,
everyone knows you drink this green neon garbage
it's
water.
Fantastic, and it's not coffee. Let me tell you something about... And not only does everyone who watches this show probably drink coffee, but they probably pay a lot of money for the coffee they drink, which is a complete waste of money. My green soda that's nasty garbage water, 67 cents for a 2-liter.
I want them to continue paying lots of money for coffee because when we say, if you're the kind of person who would take us out for a cup of coffee if you knew us, then maybe give a little money to the Patreon. Because then if they pay more for coffee, they'll give more to the Patreon account. All right, let's get started.
What makes a sermon deep?
I don't know what that means.
Well,
define your terms.
All right. Every day on social media, I see at least 4 or 5. When you have a lot of friends on social media, you get a lot of stuff in your feed. And I see at least 4 or 5 posts a day about what's wrong with preaching in America today. Preaching in America is shallow. Preaching in America is milquetoast, etc., etc. What's wrong with our pulpits in America? Now, America's a big country, and there's hundreds of thousands of churches in America, literally. And I don't know who has actually been to all of them to know that these sermons are all bad and shallow and milquetoast. But it seems to me that you get an impression if you watch, like, say, the low-hanging fruit, people will pick Joel Osteen, for example, and say that's shallow preaching. As if the typical Southern Baptist preacher is preaching like Joel Osteen, which... You visited a lot of Southern Baptist churches. Do you find that's actually the case?
I don't. When I visit the Southern Baptist churches, I'm the one preaching. So
right, but you know the pastors.
So if I go by that, they're all preaching fantastic sermons. but
you know these pastors.
Well, I'll tweak what you've said a little bit. I had to do an assignment for a preaching course where I took preachers from various categories. So like one category was like Al Mohler and D. James Kennedy and these kind of people that a lot of people would think of as the deep preachers, you know.
Right.
And then the second, and I had to pick one of those, and I don't remember who I picked. And then the second category was some of these more Andy Stanley type people. So you had, you know, like Greg, what's the guy's name that does all the big Greg Laurie.
Yeah.
Then you had
Evangelist guy.
Andy Stanley, and you had people like that. And then in the third category, and I think they threw in there something that didn't seem to fit to me, which is who's the guy at the Vineyard Church that everybody talks about, the Calvinist guy who he's all time preaching, he's everywhere. I don't know. Anyway, he was in there. But then the third category was like these kind of word of faith type preachers, or preachers that were more charismatic, or not. And those are not the same thing. But I'm just saying that they, whoever put this together, which was probably a Southern Baptist,
They threw them all in the same basket.
Right. And one of those was you
had to do Joyce Meyer, didn't
Joyce
you?
Meyer,
Yeah.
and I did Joyce Meyer. I picked Joyce Meyer because I wanted to find out.
Because you never just sat around and listened to see what...
And I in no way endorse Joyce Meyer. However, what I will say is the particular message that was on offer for me to assess was very much standard fare, I think, at most churches, most evangelical churches, even cessationist type churches. So I don't want to say Southern Baptist because we always say Southern Baptist. You talk about Southern Baptist more than you talk about anything else. And so it's just evangelical, even cessationist.
Well, that's my experience for 25 years of my life. I mean,
That's fine, but whatever. Her message would have been very much at home there.
Like, she didn't say anything that you wouldn't hear.
She said things I disagreed with.
Right.
But they're things I disagreed with in a manner that it's kind of like,
But you could do that with any preacher.
But I could say that with these same kind of people, right?
Yeah.
So why are we talking about this? I'm not sure, but that was my experience.
Yeah. I don't know that I don't listen to... The preachers I listen to are my friends, and I don't really listen to much else.
Well, let's go ahead and clear the deck. Let me help out here. So, obviously, there is boring preaching.
Yes.
That is a separate category. There is boring preaching that is probably theologically rigorous. Okay, let's put that into one category. And I know what you want to say is a lot of the people that are thought to be theologically rigorous aren't theologically rigorous. That was the point of what we were just saying. But there is that category, the boring and theologically rigorous. There is also the category that is like Andy Stanley is a great example, that is not boring and
Perceived to
questionably
be
theologically rigorous.
shallow.
Theologically,
Yeah.
we're not talking about biblically. We'll get to that, but theologically is and apologetically is some good stuff.
Or
there,
some people
right?
would say, some people have the impression that it's not. Some people have the impression that it's theologically inept.
Okay, well, whatever. But the
Yeah.
point is, I'm just laying the field here.
Like when they
So
say
you've got that.
something about his...
Well, let's not hone in on him yet.
Okay.
And then you've got this other category that we all agree is so shallow, so weak. It may not be boring. You notice I'm weaving the enjoyment factor here because I agree with Dr. Elliott, despite what any spiritually sounding person on the internet wants to say, if a sermon is not enjoyed, it will not be listened to.
Right.
And so there is a category of person over here that it gives you really enjoyable but completely shallow preaching that is not at all helpful except as entertainment.
Right.
That is the field. Those are broad categories.
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
So I've set them up so you knock them down. What do you
Okay,
want to
well,
say about
here's
this?
the thing. Yeah, I agree with you that enjoyable is important, but it's better when it's coupled with...
I have to turn off my phone.
Oh, well, it wouldn't be Trinity Radio if your phone didn't go off. A sermon needs to be enjoyable because it doesn't matter how rigorous it is. If it's boring, nobody cares.
Right.
And I also want to make the distinction that theologically rigorous doesn't mean interesting either. It can still be boring. There are lecturers who are dry as dust, and there are lecturers who are not, and you learn a lot more from the ones who are not. The more colorful the lecturer is, the more you're going to learn, the more you're going to retain. Fact of life. Mm-hmm. So I want to make sure that we're clear.
Go to. I'll go ahead and
you can be as
buzzmark it
deep
here.
as you think you are, but if you're boring, it doesn't matter.
Go to biblicaltraining.org. I'll buzzmark it for them because it's a great Calvinist site, mostly Calvinist site. And they have free audio lectures. You just have to create like a user account or whatever. It's free. But anyway, get in there and listen to Ronald Nash. And then listen to anyone on that site that is not Ronald Nash. And you will see how theologically rigorous plus enjoyable to listen to, which is what you get with Ronald Nash, increases your learning abilities seemingly infinitely.
Sure. But people seem to think that if they talk about theology in a sermon, take these preachers who always talk about, I know that it's been a while since I've listened to preachers, so I'm going to go into the Wayback Machine, I guess. But like Mark Driscoll used to always mention theological issues in his sermon. Mm-hmm. And I think John Piper would do that kind of thing. And some people think that, oh, they do it, they're popular, we should do it. And people think that if they talk about their theological systems or whatever, that they're being deep. Mm-hmm. But I have found, when I listen to that kind of stuff, it's actually so superficially shallow, especially if it's polemical, that you don't learn anything that you couldn't learn off of a Facebook fight on the internet. Right?
Yeah.
So is that really a deep sermon?
Okay, so let's, me and you right here, construct what we think a deep sermon should be that would be helpful, okay, that would be good. All right, I'm going to start off by giving a possible definition, and then what you and I are going to do is whittle away at it.
Okay.
All right? Okay, here's what I think it should be. So my dad used to tell me when I was preaching that, especially on Sunday nights and Wednesday nights, but it should be all the time, if people are going to actually do the effort to come to church, then you... Hold on, my computer. If people are going to put out the effort to actually come to your church, then you should probably give them something worth them having come there. And so here's going to be my definition.
Well, wouldn't the holy person say, "Yeah, but God is worth"? Yeah. Right.
But
we don't. That's
but I could go to any church in town and get
say,
that.
Yeah.
Why do I need to go to your church?
Right.
Okay. So here's the thing. So I'm going to say a deep sermon in the positive sense, that the kind of deep that you should be hunting for would be a sermon that presents information, theological or biblical information, that most of the crowd or a substantial portion of the crowd is not familiar with or didn't know, that is also helpful to their living the Christian life. That's our starting point. Let me try to rephrase. Is deep preaching of the kind we want is preaching that involves presenting biblical or theological concepts that a substantial portion of the congregation is probably not familiar with, and that will help them in their Christian life.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I like that definition because it's standard homiletics, but it's easier said than done, because what would that look like in a sermon? So I hear people, they will talk about, every expository preacher type loves to get to either Galatians or Romans, right? And of course, they're going to put more into Romans 1:18 through.
Because Galatians was the rough draft for Romans, right?
Yeah, so 18 through chapter 1:18 through the end of the chapter, they're going to go wonky and
cut out all the interesting narrative stuff like Paul's testimony.
They're gonna wobble a bit through chapter 2. Chapter 2 is let's just get through it, because people mistakenly think that chapter 2 is just in the middle of chapter 1 and 3 verse 20 as one major section about one thing, which is already false. But then they're going to muddle through chapter 3, 1 through 9, and then they're going to kick into high gear verses 10 through the end of the chapter. They're going to be fine through chapter 4. They're going to be fine through chapter 5. They're going to be fine through chapter 6. They're going to totally get wrong chapter 7. Then they're going to be fine through chapter 8, and then they're going to confuse everybody with chapter 9. Whether even if you're reformed or not reformed, when you get there, you're going to be, shilling
for a little bit.
Yeah, and you're going to be shilling for your team, and that might last through 10 and 11, and then all of a sudden, when they get to chapter 12 through 16, they're bored with Romans because they don't put the same emphasis into chapters 12 through 16 that they do in the big parts that have the big doctrines in it, or at least what they think they have the big doctrines, and then even worse, think that they're right about those doctrines. But that's another show. So we see that, and people think, oh, good, we're talking about Romans. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the big things like foreknowledge and predestination and election and justification by faith alone. And we're going to talk about all of these things. And we're going to talk about how you can't save yourself and, things that weren't really what Jews were trying to do anyway. But they're going to, and they're going to be, this is the deep stuff.
What you're trying to say is they're boxing an imaginary opponent.
Yeah. Well, that's what Paul's doing.
I know. I was just thinking of a way to work that in. But they're boxing an imaginary interlocutor that's in their pulpit with them.
Right.
Who works at Southern Seminary or something.
Yeah.
Or Asbury, depending on your flavor. And the crowd is sitting out there going, I don't know who he's fighting with or how this is relevant to my life.
Right. And they think that they've been deep because they mentioned
they wish they were seminary professors.
Right.
But since they're pastors, they're going to act like seminary professors when what you need to be doing is feeding the sheep.
Yeah, but worse is they think they've been deep because they talked about it. As if talking about that makes it a deep sermon.
Yeah.
No. People talk about it on Facebook and argue with one another on Facebook about it. And that's not deep either. Right? That's not.
But that is one. I will say the soteriological.
And I'm not
issue,
picking on Calvin. I'm talking about Arminians too.
Okay,
someone who rehashes Brian Abasciano's 3 volumes on Romans 9 to disprove Calvinism from the pulpit.
Most of the people that are listening to you don't know what you're talking about, even on our show.
No, they know who. Our listeners know who Brian.
No, our listeners are now no longer the 10 obsessed with soteriology people that we once had. Now we've got people like my very biblically knowledgeable friend who fixes stuff at my house. Yeah. And he's interested in soteriology, but when you say Brian Abasciano, he thinks you just spoke in tongues.
No, if you listen to Leighton Flowers, because Leighton Flowers quotes him all the time.
Not everybody listens to Leighton Flowers. What I was going to say is going to be helpful to what you're saying, but also broaden it, which is the soteriology issue. I don't want people to get from what you're saying that the soteriological issue is not one of those things that can deepen a sermon in a helpful way. But you just can't let that be all you do.
Right.
And even in Romans, let that be all you do.
Or worse, think that you're being deep because you talked about a theological issue.
You got to talk about it in a helpful way.
Yeah, we're human beings. Deep is not just head knowledge. Deep has got to slam you right in the heart, too. And I think that if you don't have a sermon that hits you in the heart as well as the head, I don't think it's a deep sermon. I think it might be an interesting lecture when that's not the job of the pulpiteer, but it's not necessarily a deep sermon. You just talked about what people talk about on Facebook. Good.
Now, what you just said, though, it's not necessarily so people don't do Wednesday night sermons anymore. I mean, it's like dying, and Sunday night's dying. But there are places in church life where a preacher could preach a more theologically focused, a sermon that is less about personal application and more about understanding theology. Because one thing we certainly agree is that church people should learn some of that stuff. I think they should learn a lot, as much of it as they can.
Well, let me give you a compliment for a second there. Okay. Not necessarily theology, but apologetics. You preached a sermon, not a lecture, preached a sermon on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In an apologetic way where you gave defenses for it. And yet, when I left that sermon, it wasn't just, he said some things that I teach in my course. No, it was, I'm ready to talk about this to everybody and let them know what my Savior has done, what God has done in Christ, raising him from the dead, so that I can be forgiven and live forever.
Yeah.
You don't get that from a lecture on the resurrection. You don't get that even from a debate on the resurrection. But
you certainly don't get it from a debate.
Yeah, but you can get it from a sermon on the resurrection where you're giving heady apologetic information to show people why we believe what we believe, and yet still have that sense of wonder that there was a God who became a man and died on a cross to forgive me for our sins, and was raised from the dead, and wow, that changed those people's lives. I see the change in my life, and I want to go share this with the world. That you don't get that even from a lecture on.
I'll tell you what I.
So sermons can still penetrate.
I appreciate that, and I think this is one thing that there's this whole debate among people that aren't out winning people for Jesus, but want to have this kind of debate about whether or not a sermon should be art or science.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just kidding. That's a relevant debate. But I think the answer is both.
Right.
And there is, but here's the thing.
But
When
isn't
you
that what
present-
everyone says now? Is both?
Well, they've been listening to me then. But when you present it to the crowd, there's art. This sermon should be arranged artfully. Your preaching of it should have a certain form of artistry that goes along with it. And so so think about a piece of art. You're right. It should move you. It should challenge you. It should do all those kind of things that actual art does not do to me. But if we were to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art or whatever in New York, and we were to go look at some art that was really great, you probably don't want to go to that museum if you want to see great art. But anyway, you go to that museum. You're going in here looking at this art, and you go into a room, and there's this whole Rembrandt that like stretches the entire wall. And you're looking at this thing, and at first it looks like a bunch of flowers or whatever. But then after a few minutes, you're like in it, and you're in that painting, and you're feeling emotions that he tricked you through time and space with his use of color into experiencing. It wasn't really tricking. He just evoked them. Okay, that's art. Now imagine us going into another room of that museum, and on the wall someone has just put a piece of paper on a canvas that has a bunch of text. Now, frankly, because it's the MoMA or whatever, the Museum of Modern Art, they probably would think that was amazing, you know, because I think I did see a canvas that just had like coffee spilled down one side, and they were like, "This is the greatest thing ever," and it's not. It's I could have done that. My Isabel, my daughter, could have done that. Right. So,
and May in fact has.
But yeah, she probably has. But anyway, in reality, is a big thing of text printed off from your computer and pasted onto a canvas, is that really art? Well, depending on how loose you want to get with art being subjective. But the fact about it is, no, I want the thing that puts me in a world. Yeah. I want the thing that brings stuff out of me that I didn't know was there and then confronts me with it. And a bunch of text written on a wall, I mean, why am I, you know. So I think a sermon should do that, especially given the fact that whether we like it or not, a certain number of people, I mean, we would all love it if what sermons were, some of the time, like every other Sunday, was lecture Sunday, and somebody just got up and lectured if they were good.
Right.
You know, if I could hear N.T. Wright or somebody just get up every other Sunday, and then every other Sunday is my pastor, okay, now that's great. You know,
right. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can have that because of the internet. But the point of it is, the people out there are not like us, and they don't necessarily care to hear N.T. Wright. Actually, he's pretty artful, but they don't care to hear some lecture every other Sunday.
Right.
And so if you want to get them to care about this, there's got to be art involved in it. There's got to be pathos. There's got to be that sort of stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
And so if you're just, all you are is you've gone through and gotten your PhD, and now you're going to go off and pastor and be the greatest pastor that ever was, and the way you know you're succeeding is how much you're boring the people out there. Yeah, good luck, sucker.
Yeah.
That's not how it works.
And by the way, that's not even deep.
Right.
Because people think deep means, okay, so in my misspent youth, you know, hanging around with people, you know, sometimes it's just stoner deep. You know how people get, whoa, that's deep, man. You know, it's actually not very deep at all. They just said something kind of stupid.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of want to make a similar analogy that people think that because they're talking about all of these highfalutin metaphysics about, you know, theology or you know, some systematic theology topic, or they're talking, you know, deep background about something that's actually deep, like that's meaningfully deep. But when I think of deep, I think of something penetrating down deep into somebody,
right?
Not deep into your footnotes.
I'll give you an example.
Right, but people mistake that if their sermon has footnotes, that, you know, deep into the footnotes, that's how deep I got because I went to these sources that I have in my Logos software. That's not deep.
Right.
That's not for preaching. A deep sermon for preaching needs to hit you deep, me deep. That's what I think of deep.
And be understood and be useful, I think.
Yeah, well, I think because they're not actually as deep as they think. I think what they are is understandable. They just might be boring.
Yeah.
It's very... So there was a church here in Evansville. Before you get to your example, let me give you an example. There's a church, not in Evansville, in Newburgh. Okay? It was a Southern Baptist church plant. And the guy was preaching through Galatians. Okay? And before that he had gotten to he was an expository preacher because he was properly, trained to be the good 9 marks guy, right? And his church is no longer existent in Evansville, by the way, or in Newport, by the way. It folded, which I hate to see, but but he was so boring. It was 45 minutes long of a sermon where he wasn't even still in the first chapter of Galatians, but he so wanted to talk about justified by faith and not works of the law in Galatians. He so wanted to get there that he was already talking about that. So it's like, well, you're not there yet. What are you going to preach on if this is about to hear the same thing? Because he couldn't deal with the text because he didn't think that there was anything in all of this stuff about Paul confronting Peter and the background to Antioch and what the Judaizers were up to and what their actual thing was and all of this other stuff. That just didn't...
Are you trying to say he started a series because there was a verse way down the line he wanted
to get to,
and so now he's got to wade through all this stuff that he doesn't know what he's talking about,
right?
To get to this thing that
because
he
wasn't as excited about that as he was getting to where. So he wants to color the whole text of Galatians with that bit and drag it, to previous verses where Paul's setting all this stuff up, right? And so we did give him 2 weeks in a row, and we heard the same sermon 2 weeks in a row, and we learned nothing about the text that he was actually talking about because he was already digging from the well from the proof text that he wanted to get to in Galatians. But he thought he was being deep because he went verse by verse. And he thought he was being deep because he was talking about the doctrine of justification and how we all can't save ourselves, as if I run around in culture and nobody out that I meet's trying to save themselves, but for some reason preachers think this is a good line in our culture that you can't save yourself. Culture's saying we're not trying to. Keep your Christianity. So I don't know why that, but that's that's another different thing. But the point is, just because you are going verse by verse and you are talking about the doctrine of justification as you understand it, doesn't mean you've said anything deep. You've talked for 45 minutes and bored everybody to tears. And by the way, sorry, your church isn't there anymore. And I think that happens more than what people call shallow preaching. Because maybe it's the circles I run in, but if everybody is complaining about the shallow preaching, who's doing it? Which one? They never tell you, of course. It's pulpits in America. Which pulpits where? What's your example?
I don't know. I'm completely lost. A while ago, you said something about how what they're actually doing is akin to what you termed stoner deep, which I'm imagining, because I've never once touched marijuana, I'm imagining that you're talking about what I've seen in films where somebody gets high and then they start talking about something that sounds somewhat philosophical, but really what they're saying is something not that complicated.
Okay, here's an example of stoner deep. Okay, take your conversation with Matt on Marco Polo that you put on the internet and make it about twice as long and twice as stupid, and that's stoner deep. Okay.
No, do you want to have that conversation right now? Because we'll find out how stoner deep it is. I'm ready to have that conversation, especially when
I said make it stupider. Not that y'all's thing was stupid. I just say make it stupider, and then you'll understand. Like, well, man, time is this. It's this dimension of space that just, it's like, you can't transfer. It's just like, wow, we can't get to the present because it's all...
I think we all know what you mean by stoner deep.
And that's... that sounds quite a bit like your conversation.
We've seen movies. I think we know what you mean by stoner deep. So what I was going to say is, here's an example. Okay. So I'm working on a theistic argument, an argument for God's existence. Which, by the way, is something that is deep and is useful.
Yes.
But anyway, I was working on that, and I was telling my wife in frustration, I said, I'm experiencing this weird phenomenon where when you are saying something in a way nobody's ever said it before exactly that way, there's nothing new under the sun, okay, I got it, but when you're saying something in a way no one's ever said it before, or connecting concepts that haven't really been formally connected before.
At least in a useful way.
Yeah, so I said, but when I do that, when I'm doing this, because it's fresh, which is exciting, you kind of get this feeling like you're just making stuff up, even though you're not. And I said this to my wife, and she's like, isn't that what you philosophy guys just always do, is just make stuff
Just
up?
making stuff up.
And I was like, how dare you? And first of all, what a philosophical assertion. Are you just making stuff up? And then I went on to explain I said, but listen to this. So I explained the theistic argument, and I put her through it, and I checked every step of the way. Does this make sense to you? Does this make sense to you? Does this make sense? And when we got to the end, she was like, oh, wow. Yeah, you're not making stuff up. That's powerful.
But in fairness to Sarah, there is a little bit of truth to it.
No, but hold on. She said that is really powerful when she got to the end. And I think that's the difference, is saying something in such a way that it sounds to you and the audience and everybody else like you're just making stuff up, and then taking people on a journey with you in a sermon to where they see how you got from point A to point B kind of in a surprising way. And they lived it to a certain degree. And that's what the culture sets people up to think. Preachers and apologists, they're just making stuff up. They don't have good reasons to believe any of this. And the stuff they're telling you isn't even good for your life. You know, Benjamin Franklin would say, you know, I don't believe Christianity, but it's helpful. It's good for society. It's all this moral stuff, you know.
Right.
We don't even have that anymore, because our secular society now says, no. What you guys are saying is that we should worship a murderous, whatever, all the horrible things, genocidal, homophobic monster of the Old Testament, and the very idea that you're teaching that means that now you're voting in ways that limit equality and what women's right to choose, all these kind of things, right? So we don't even have that going for us. The culture is saying, you apologists don't have any good reason to believe what you're saying, and you pastors are preaching stuff that's bad and dangerous. We don't even have the benefit of the doubt when we get in the pulpit anymore. And because we don't even have the benefit of the doubt, you sure better not get up there and reinforce the idea that they come into the church with, that what you're doing is just making a bunch of stuff up. You better come in there and walk them through ideas and walk them through the Bible and walk them through theology, so that when they come out the other side, they have lived it and they are changed by it, and it is affecting them, like you said, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, in every way.
Which means you have to use illustrations, sometimes humor.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think preachers don't have to be funny all the time. It's not stand-up.
It certainly
theology.
helps if you're funny.
Yeah, it helps, but I mean, you don't have to always be funny. That's ridiculous.
Well, there's a difference between telling a dumb joke, and naturally being.
Yeah, but you love dumb preacher jokes, and you say you get one free one per sermon.
I usually try to use one dumb preacher joke per sermon,
right. But
you try to be funny throughout the sermon in subtle ways that draw people in. So if someone, here's an example. I was preaching on commercialism, or something to do with commercialism, when I was in Texas at a church on Sunday morning just a few weeks ago, and someone's phone at a very tense moment went off with, I can't remember what it was, but it was a jingle for some company. And it was in this big auditorium of like 500 people, and this jingle goes off that is a very recognizable, I don't know what it was, some company that when you hear it, you know.
Very recognizable. I have no idea what
I don't remember what it was, but it was very recognizable. And I was able to say, hey, thanks for that obvious illustration. That's the commercialism we're talking about. Infecting the church. I said something like that. Yeah. That's not a joke, but it's funny. And everybody there, because they're all sitting out there and they're thinking, oh shoot, somebody's phone just went off. Glad that's not me. Oh my gosh, what's this guy going to do?
Have a little
and you
bit
took the steam out of it, So you can be funny without telling jokes all the time. And in fact, I think that's part of the problem, is that preachers think they got to go to sermonillustrations.com and get jokes that are made for preachers to use, that 15 other preachers have used before. And I guarantee you, if you go to any preaching conference in America today, you will hear jokes that you have heard at other preaching conferences, because everybody uses the same jokes because they're all getting them from some website.
Unlike Braxton Hunter, I don't want to put pressure on pastors out there to be funny. But
I just said it helps.
It does help to be, but I do want to put pressure on you to use illustrations, because illustrations connect people from an ancient text to the modern world and help them get their head around things. And the more you know about the modern world, the easier it is to connect ancient concepts. And the more you know about the ancient concepts, you're going to get things right. So all around better. So use illustrations to connect it. That's where pastors make it relevant for me, because pastors are not going to tell me something in the Bible generally that I don't already know. And I'm not trying to be
most of the people
I'm not
aren't
trying
you.
to be. Yeah, I know. I'm not trying to be. But here's what I do know. Just like everyone else listening to them, when he gets to the illustrations, that's where my ears and everyone else's ears perk up and listen, and that's where the light bulb goes off, even for me and even for other people, about where do we take this. And I'm just right along with everybody, whether they're familiar with the text or not. It doesn't matter. I can look around and see it on their faces. I can hear it in the amens and the louder cheers that they get after the illustrations. Whereas it's like, I get it. That makes sense. That means I need to go do this. It means I need to believe this way. It means I need to praise God in this manner instead of that. I need to evoke some kind of change. But just communicating the contents alone is not what preaching was ever about. Preaching was about provoking a response. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, if you can get a response, that's a deep sermon.
Yeah.
A sermon that evokes no response, but you are filled with more heady ideas that don't go anywhere. Mm-hmm. You know, it was interesting in church. I visited Braxton's church, and the speaker gave this presentation of the Passover, okay? And I assume you knew most of that.
Actually, there was a good deal I did not know.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She went through
He hasn't done his Exodus commentary yet, so...
Well, they went through they had this table and
right.
and went through everything that goes on in a Passover celebration,
right,
and pointed out the Jesus stuff in it.
But the point about...
Most churches have had...
But the point about with Jesus' Passover meal and everything else that stood out to me was bringing it home at... Well, I mean, we know the story. And we know the Passion story. Right? But that's not just retelling a story. It's the remembrance, and it was the fact that the reason why it's centered around things that you can touch, taste, and smell, and all of those enlivens all your senses. That's what I think stuck out to me most, is like, yes, because that gives you something to connect with.
Yeah, it's experiential.
Right, and that's the same thing with I think what sermon illustrations help, right? Mm-hmm. And they'll always, sermon illustrations point to something that you can connect with that gives you a fully, a way that you can, even if you don't have all your sense perceptions firing at once, whatever you take with you will inevitably engage all of them, right? So, or most of them. And so that's why I think, when I think of a deep sermon, what was really deep is something that I leave with that becomes a part of me.
Yeah.
Not a part of my mental contents, but a part of my daily life. And if a sermon doesn't do that, I don't care how much background on a text that you could give or that I could give on a New Testament passage. I don't care about how much systematic theology you can tease out of the text in a sermon. If it doesn't go anywhere, it's not deep. Yeah. It's just heady.
Yeah. And sometimes what deep can be is in the 2 Peter sense. You know, 2 Peter, we're learning, you know, if you affirm Peter's authorship, which I do, Peter's about to die. And so he's saying, he basically is saying in chapter 1, I think, I'm not going to tell you stuff you don't already know.
Right.
I'm bringing stuff to your remembrance.
Yeah.
Did it ever cross anyone's mind that you can do that in a deep way? And first of all, that is where you, even if you never learn anything that you never knew before in a sermon, you can still make connections and have things called to your remembrance in a helpful way for your Christian life, whether the person up there is a bachelor student in seminary or
right.
not.
But only if they drive it home.
Well, let me finish.
Yeah.
So what could be done is someone is bringing up ideas that you're already familiar with, but then connects them with biblical concepts that you weren't connecting before. So that's a great example of that. What we saw Sunday in church is, for me, I guess not for you, because you know everything about everything except whether Methodists and Wesleyans are different. But we're taking something that I knew already. Okay, I know that the Passover images Christ, and that there's a tupos there of Christ, and all that sort of thing. But some of the specifics of that is connecting in ways that it's like, oh shoot, That is pretty good and pretty obvious, you know. But this is all going back to, it's got to be helpful. It's got to actually be, it's deep, it's experienced. It like you said, impacts your life going out. Let's think of a movie that's that way. I remember when I first saw Castaway with Tom Hanks. I knew, this is going to sound weird, but walking out of the theater, I knew I am going to think about certain things completely differently for the rest of my life because I saw that movie.
Like a buffet table.
What?
Well, when he came back and they had the reception for him, the way he looked at the table.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Right. Yeah. And seeing it through from his experience, that would be amazing. If all you did was spear fish for
You've got that sort of thing. Yeah. How you see the world now that you've been on this island for 4 years or whatever it was. Thoughts about the extent of suffering, you know, when he's considering committing suicide and all that, and what do you do here? How should I view these things? Love and marriage. How should I feel about coming back? And sorry, spoiler alert, I come back and now that Helen Hunt has now married somebody else, how should I feel if I'm married to Helen Hunt and she's married somebody else? Actually, I'm fine with it if Helen Hunt marries somebody else. But the bottom line is, how do you feel about coming back and your wife has now married someone else?
Do you need a spoiler alert for a movie that's been out that long?
Well, yeah, you're right. But the
that's
thing
like
is,
Robert Geiler when he said, "Spoiler alert." Hector dies.
Right. But I came out of that film knowing I will not see certain aspects of reality the same way I used to. And if you think oh, come on, it was a dumb movie. No, that was a powerful narrative.
Yeah.
And movies can be that, and literature can be that, and sermons can be that. Yeah. You know, the thing is, I'll give you an example of one. I know that we have a lot of people that listen who believe in conditional immortality, right? Yeah. Annihilationism, that when you die, you go to hell and stuff happens and then you die. I say stuff happens because that's a point of disagreement among people that affirm conditional immortality. However,
it's an open question.
I remember when I first heard the explanation from a traditionalist on that view, the traditionalist view of hell, about why it's just.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether all conditionalists would think this, but even if you're a conditionalist, perhaps you could say, even if intuitively it doesn't feel like the character of God, perhaps you could say God would be just in that kind of traditionalist view of hell. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the logic of it. If explained well.
So here's the logic of it.
This is the cat?
The cat thing, yeah. So imagine that I'm watching television and a cat is whining at my window, and every night, and finally let's imagine that I strangle the cat because it's annoyed me so much. And I would never do that, but let's just say I did. And
you would do that.
And then I know there's a punishment for that. If someone finds out, and especially if it's someone else's cat, I don't know what the punishment is, but maybe I have to pay a fine, maybe I have to spend the night in jail. I don't know. But let's imagine then that my neighbor keeps buying more and more cats, and ever so often I have to kill these cats, and ultimately I go and strangle my neighbor so he stops buying these cats. Okay, now there is a greater penalty. There was a penalty for, if you like, sinning against a cat that was minuscule compared to my own life. Now I've sinned against my neighbor by killing him. There's a penalty for that equal to my life. I may be in prison for the rest of my life. I may receive capital punishment. I don't know. So you can see that there's a stair step of justice, and it's intuitive. Everyone hearing me talk right now knows that I shouldn't necessarily die for killing a cat, but should I die for killing a man? Maybe, you know? Okay, so then what is the penalty for sinning against an everlasting God? The penalty is everlasting.
Right.
Okay, now, but there is a solution for that, which is that God could come as an everlasting person and die for the everlasting sin that you committed, so that you don't have to go to hell everlastingly. Now, whether or not you believe in the traditional view of hell for other reasons that involve what hell is like, or the biblical data, which I get it. We did 2 episodes on that. You can go back and listen to them from this year, earlier this year. But the point is that when I heard that, because I think every Christian that believes in the traditional view of hell thinks, come on, man. the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime. You know, some little old lady,
Yeah.
you know, she lives a pretty good life, but she just never gets saved. And then she's going to go to the same hell as Adolf Hitler or whatever, you know. Okay, well, the fact is, if you sinned against an everlasting
God's
God,
not a cat.
it all makes sense, yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying that it makes sense emotionally,
Yeah.
but intellectually, I think you can make sense of that.
Right.
Now, I know that for some of you all that doesn't work, but that is a good example of something that I heard in a sermon.
Yeah.
That when I heard it, I walked out of there like with Castaway, I'll never see the world quite the same way ever again. I wrote a sermon on heaven that I preached at Vane Avenue Baptist Church here in town several years ago. And then I preached that sermon on heaven across America now. And it's my favorite sermon that I preach. And you know what? The first time I ever preached it, my wife was there, and she heard me preach it, and she said, that is without question the best thing you've ever said. She said that was your Where the Streets Have No Name. that was the greatest thing ever. And the reason was because she was expressing that like Castaway. Yeah. You walked out of that sermon having learned something. I'm not here bragging on myself. The point is,
this was a few years ago?
This would have been maybe 8 years ago, yeah.
So he peaked 8 years ago is what he said.
Probably, in terms of my preaching.
Right.
But I walked out of there. I had given them stuff they'd never heard before, because I did talk about evidential stuff related to heaven. Yeah. So I gave them stuff they never heard before. It was emotionally powerful, and my wife was saying, I walked out of there, I will never think about reality in heaven ever the same way again. That is deep preaching. Yeah. And I don't do it hardly enough, and I'm not saying I'm a great preacher. I have some sermons on our YouTube channel you can find out for yourself. But that's deep in the way that's helpful.
And not all your sermons do that to people.
No. But the benefit I have, and this is, again, didn't you just say you recently read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin? Okay, so you'll recall that one of the things he said about George Whitefield that I thought was so on the nose was he said evangelists like Whitefield have a benefit that pastors cannot have because
they get to speak the same sermons at different places, and
they figure out
and they constantly improve and get to work on it and rehearse it and
where a pastor has to move on from a sermon, Whitefield is able to preach the same sermon everywhere he goes, and he figures out what hits, what doesn't hit, what gets a laugh, what makes a cry, all those kind of things, and what is helpful because people tell him. And he's like, so there's no comparing an evangelist to a pastor in that respect. And I think that is true. So are most of my sermons in some way successful and hit the mark? Not the first time I preach them. But eventually they get there.
Yeah. So to sum up, I just want to say, to me, a deep sermon is not how much head stuff you can stuff in there.
Yeah.
A deep sermon is what hits home with the people who came to hear you preach.
Yeah.
And so I think that some of the... I have never been to every church in America, so I have no idea how anyone can claim, the preaching... Now, I know that there's a state of theology where a bunch of evangelicals and a bunch of non-Christians, a bunch of Americans in general, were tested on their theology as if the pulpit could be, the sole blame for that anyway. I mean, churches should have whole discipleship. Mm-hmm. But anyway, everyone's like, oh, it's bad or whatever. Okay, fine. But I don't see how anyone can claim most preaching in America is shallow just because of secularism or whatever else. It could be. I don't know. I have no way of knowing. But here's what I do know. I do know that people who have fancied certain individuals as being the model are not the model that I think work at all for most people. In fact, a lot of these much heralded speakers and great expositors are actually terrible at what they do. And nobody should do that. And people who try to do what they do fail at it. So
look, here's the definition.
We're not picking on...
we fixed it in the first 10 minutes. We came up with a definition for deep preaching. Deep preaching, in a way that's helpful, the good kind of deep preaching that we should be after, is preaching that you suspect is, whatever the concepts are, the substantial number of the people in the congregation are not familiar with it, and it's helpful.
Yes. It's
biblical
helpful.
And theological, and it's helpful.
Yeah. Just being head deep is not deep. I don't know the state of churches. Like I said, I don't know how shallow the preaching is. I imagine it's probably not quite as shallow because I never end up at those churches where it's just milquetoast. I always find pretty decent preachers at all of these. Of course, I run in Baptist circles, whether Southern Baptist, General Baptist, whatever, or non-denominational.
What you're saying is
Baptist,
Southern Baptist preachers are better than everybody else. That's what I hear you saying.
Could be.
I'm just kidding. That's not true.
Well, some of my favorite preachers are Southern Baptist. Paul Cooper's a Southern Baptist. Sam Schmidt's a Southern Baptist. Austin Long's a Southern Baptist. Juan Jun Lee is a Southern Baptist.
We're changing minds here, people.
Yeah.
Jonathan Pritchett's turning it around. Last week, or actually in the bonus episode of Trinity Radio that some of you missed from last week, I straightened Jonathan out on eternal security.
No, he did not.
And now he's getting straightened out on Southern Baptist theology.
Not even close.
I mean, I presented him with some facts in that episode, and he was like,
I believe that you can have a grace you can fall from and a faith that you can shipwreck. Unlike Braxton Hunter.
Listen.
But anyway.
No. Hold on.
Southern Baptist
No. Last week, I presented him with some facts.
You can watch Slash.
He's trying to shut me down. He's trying to shut me down. He's trying to shut me down.
Braxton believes that you can be cut off from a vine you were never abiding in the first place doesn't mean that he won some sort of debate that you have to pay to see.
I'm not saying I want to debate. I'm just saying
you said you convinced me.
You see how you've got to Sean Hannity what I'm saying here and not let me talk. I presented him with some data, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what to say in response to this." I can't say that you're right, but I'm 99% sure that eternal security is true now.
No,
that's exactly what happened.
Never happened.
Prove me wrong.
Actually, you prove him wrong by clicking up here and becoming a patron to watch that episode. And if you would like to learn how to preach well, Braxton Hunter preaches well.
Thank you.
He learned from his dad, and he learned from Dr. Albert Elliott, both of whom are connected here with Trinity.
But it really springs forth from my confidence in the eternal security of the believer. But check out our program at Trinity and learn from the very
everything
professors.
You learned from me since 2014. You'll notice that his preaching has drastically improved since I came to Trinity, and you'll hear him.
Actually, so you want to learn from the same preachers I've learned from. Come to Trinity College of Bible and Theological Seminary while those professors are still living. And that doesn't need commentary. And so visit us at
Trinity. Your mom watches this.
Trinitysem.edu.
Be sure and check out our sister podcast and the Trinity Commission, the Bible Bro Down with Matt and Billy, Soteriology 101 with Leighton Flowers, and The Narrow Path with Steve Gregg. This has been Trinity Radio, and despite Braxton Hunter's attempts to train wreck it at the end, I think this was a good show, and thank you for giving us your time. God bless. If you would like more content, click here, and keep watching Bible Studies. Click up here. And finally, we want you to subscribe. We need more subscribers, so click here.